Can we please start this session, because I know time's very tight. So those folk that are staying for the debate, if you could take your seats, please. So I'm Raj Patel from the University of Southampton, and my co-chair is Patrick Sullivan from Emory University. We have the pleasure and the honor to chair the first of our debates at this Congress. So the structure of the debate is going to be, we're going to allow both our speakers about 10 minutes to make their case, and then open it up to the floor. If time allows and permits, we'll give them each a minute or so to make a rebuttal, and then we may have a final vote. Usually at debates, we ask people at the beginning to indicate where they stand on the motion, and if we could have a show of hands. So the motion is that sexual education starting at age 4, is it too early? So could you raise your hands if you feel it is too early? Rough count. Do you do a rough count?
I'll do this.
Okay.
Hold them high, please. 1,
6, 7. Okay. You got a number?
Yep.
So how many have you got? 11. And those who feel so it is that it isn't too young, 4 is a good time to start. Okay. You've got your work cut out, Dennis. So if you could hold your hands up.
Too many to count.
No, you have to count them. You have to count them.
Count the nose, yeah.
Okay. Fine. Thank you very much. So I'll let my co-chair introduce our first speaker.
Thank you. Our first speaker is Dr. Mark Schuster, who is Chief of the Division of General Pediatrics and the Vice Chair for Health Policy and the William Berenberg Professor of Pediatrics at Harvard Medical School. And Dr. Schuster will argue the position that 4 is a fine time to start sexual health education. Dr. Schuster.
Is it working now? Thanks. So picture this. A class of 20 kindergartners sits in a circle. The teacher turns the page of the picture book she is reading to them, and this image appears. What are they doing? The teacher asks the class. Hugging, one boy answers. When do you hug someone? She replies. A little girl shoots up her hand, straining to be selected. If you love someone, she answers, beaming with confidence. The teacher asks the students whom they love, their mother, their grandfather, their pet goat, and how it feels when they hug them. The goal of this lesson is to teach students about what kinds of touch and intimacy feel good and what kinds don't, and when it's okay to touch people and when it's not. Basic tenets of sex ed. This lesson is from a sex ed class taught in the Netherlands as part of the Spring Fever curriculum. Schools across the Netherlands devote a full week each year to comprehensive sex ed lessons for children ages 4 to 12, with each age group focusing on different topics. For example, in kindergarten, in addition to learning about good versus bad touch, students learn about anatomy, types of families, and how babies grow in the mom's womb. Schools also hold parent nights to help parents learn how to talk to their children about topics related to sex and sexuality. The goal of this comprehensive program is not to hypersexualize 4-year-olds. Rather, it aims to create a strong foundation for healthy self-expression, communication, and awareness of sexual development and identity. Although some may believe that 4 is too early to begin sex ed in schools, and we just saw that some do believe that, or that the right age is 12 or 14 or never, by the time a child reaches the age of 4, let's face it, sex ed has already started. Children walk in on their parents having sex. They undress to play doctor with the neighbor's kid. They see provocative scenes on TV or the internet, or ask questions when the prince and princess kiss in fairy tale movies like Beauty and the Beast. They watch 2 dogs humping in the park, or 2 giraffes going at it on the savannah. Sex, relationships, and bodies are parts of life you can't get away from. So yes, sex ed has begun for most 4-year-olds. In fact, sex ed begins at birth. You're changing your son's diaper and he begins playing with his genitals. You push his hand away and wrap him up tightly in his diaper, pretending it didn't happen. Your daughter is learning to name her body parts. Did you teach her each body part but leave out her genitalia? Or did you giggle when you got to them? Or teach her the words vagina and vulva, but tell her not to practice them when she practices her words with grandma? Did you know that girls are more likely to learn the name for boys' genitals than their own? Our cultural avoidance of girls' sexuality starts even when they're toddlers. We need sex ed. Our kids begin learning about sex and sexuality early, and what we convey with our initial reactions, our words, and our omissions all send a message that sexuality and pleasure and responsibility and communication, they send a message about those. And before you know it, you'll reach the pivotal moment when your child turns to you and asks, "Daddy, how are babies made?" You may have the perfect start to your answer, but when you get to that one part, the crux of the matter, you start choking, struggling to form the words, "The penis goes in the vagina." Not surprisingly, there is no evidence that it's harmful to tell a child that the penis goes in the vagina. Yet a lot of parents feel awkward about explaining that part. If you say to your child, "You're too young to ask such questions," or "Mommy will tell you when she gets home," and then no one ever follows up, you're sending a message that these topics are off limits. Your kid will learn to look to friends for answers and eventually the internet. With the lines between fact and fiction rather blurred on the internet, young children will encounter inaccurate information and struggle to distinguish between what is true and false. We need school sex ed programs to teach accurate information to kids and destigmatize topics related to sex and sexuality. By starting sex ed at a young age, we can create an opportunity for children to ask questions and begin conversations about sex and relationships and foster healthy, informed attitudes long before sex is on their horizon. Of course, one of the key considerations for beginning sex ed at age 4 is offering age-appropriate material. 4-year-olds do not need to learn how to put on a condom. Instead, sex ed at age 4 should focus on building communication skills, learning parts of the body, and teaching about privacy and relationships. The Netherlands is not the only country to develop a strong, age-appropriate curriculum. Other areas of the world are doing so as well. In the US, specifically China, specifically Chicago, public schools, China doesn't own us completely just yet. Public schools require that sex ed be taught from kindergarten through 12th grade, with kindergartners learning about anatomy, privacy, consent, and good and bad touch, while older students learn about puberty, contraception, and STI prevention. Halfway around the world, Beijing has implemented comprehensive sex ed programs in 18 elementary schools using a series of textbooks developed by Beijing Normal University. Organizations such as UNESCO and SICUS have published evidence-based guidelines starting in kindergarten. These guidelines focus on areas such as basic concepts of anatomy, respect, and sexual orientation for younger children, and expand to anatomical function and social components of sexual development for older children. Many countries, including Brazil, anyone here from Brazil? Brazil, Argentina, Cameroon, Ethiopia, and Estonia already mandate comprehensive sex ed for primary school children without evidence of untoward effects. Many people are worried that starting sex ed earlier would promote earlier initiation of intercourse and increase sexual risk behaviors, but that is not what the research shows. And I know you know that because many of you are the ones who've done that research. In the Netherlands, on average, teens do not initiate sex earlier than other European or American teens, and they have one of the highest contraceptive utilization rates, over 90%, and one of the lowest teen pregnancy rates. We don't want to base decisions on any one country. So let's look at the rest of the world. Research analyzing comprehensive sex ed programs in countries across Africa, Asia, the Americas, and Europe has supported these findings, showing that sex ed programs were associated with delayed initiation and reduced frequency of intercourse, reduced number of partners, and increased use of contraception. None were associated with earlier initiation or increased frequency of sex. These studies did not specifically focus on programs for 4-year-olds, but I mention them because they reinforce the value of sex ed programs and emphasize the likelihood that the benefits will be comparable if extended younger. Think about it. People used to say that sex ed was bad for women, but that turned out to be false. They said it was bad for adolescents, but that turned out to be false. They said it was bad for pre-adolescents, and that turned out to be false. The evidence to date, which I've already described, suggests that claims that sex ed for 4-year-olds will be bad will also be proved false. I'd like to make another point, and this one is perhaps a bit more subtle. We teach our children about many things well before they need to know them, whether it's about money, jobs, alcohol, driving, or voting. That's how education works. We teach at the edge of understanding, and kids catch up with us. Why would we want to treat sex ed any differently? Sex is a natural part of life. Why should it be hidden away, treated as some big secret, only to be taught too late, like after the child has already had intercourse, or noticed powerful attractions, or discovered masturbation and thought that it would be harmful because no one has talked about it before? The reason most of us don't homeschool our children is that most parents don't have the skills they need to teach their kids. How many of you have had kids who have kids have tried to teach them how to divide? Addition isn't so bad, but division, at least for me, was really hard. It reinforced why we need teachers who can instruct on all sorts of topics that parents understand themselves but don't know how to teach. And lest anyone worry that sex ed usurps a parent's role in teaching values, quite the contrary is true. Good sex ed is non-judgmental and helps children think about values and encourages them to talk about values with their parents. We can and we should teach our children about sex and sexuality before they initiate sexual activity or have the conscious desire to. We want our kids to establish healthy, safe attitudes, and we want them to be able to talk and ask questions. If we start talking about these topics at a basic level, these conversations will progress naturally as kids mature. And schools are uniquely positioned to help teach these messages. Teachers can provide accurate, age-appropriate lessons, reach large numbers of children, and support parents. Starting sex ed at age 4 will not corrupt and damage our kids. It will help them to become self-aware, build communication skills, and establish healthy, open attitudes towards sexual development.
Thank you very much, Mark. Okay, so we needed a big hitter, so we've invited Dennis FOrtenberry to make the case, if he can, against the motion that it is too young. Dennis is the director of the section of adolescent medicine, the Donald Orr Professor of Adolescent Medicine at Indiana University. So, Dennis, you've got 10 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mark. I had no idea it would be this easy. So I'm going to make 4 points to justify why age 4 is too young for sex education. The first is empirical sketchiness, pedagogical murkiness, social and cultural rejection, and policy confusion. Let me just define sketchy for you, Mark. It's not thorough or detailed, and as in the information they had was sketchy, meaning incomplete, patchy, fragmentary, cursory, or perfunctory. So almost more than 15 years ago, almost 20 years ago, I participated in a conference on childhood sexuality at the Kinsey Institute in Indiana. And over the course of 3 days, we could talk about young people's children's apparent demonstration of interest in sex, in terms of what they did, what their parents reported primarily. We could talk about exposure to familial nudity. We could talk about interpersonal actions, but we could not, after that full review with experts from around the world, come up with a model of childhood sexuality that both explained it as in something that we could empirically address and connect to subsequent sexuality. That has not changed over the past 15 years, and the amount of data that we have about young people's sexuality continues to be almost non-existent. Because of that, we don't understand what the critical developmental targets are that we're trying to educate people for. There are very few data that identify what we assume these deficiencies are so that we can fill them in some way that's amenable to a systematic educational intervention that should supplement or replace the learning that goes on in families already. Mark talked about outcomes data, but in fact there are none. And it doesn't make sense to me to just fully extrapolate from sex education that occurs starting at age 12 or 10 or whenever you choose to talk about starting it, and say that that's the same as the outcomes that you get when you start with 4-year-olds. None of the data that we have address the implementation of sex education on subsequent outcomes that we're interested in, like early pregnancy, like sexually transmitted infections, like consensual, pleasurable, happy sex that we wish for everyone. Pedagogical murkiness. Murky, not fully explained or understood, especially with concealed dishonesty, Mark. Questionable, suspicious, dubious, dark. Pedagogical murkiness has to do with the confusion about whether this is sex. Is it focused on sex? Is it focused on sexuality? Is it really focused on sexual health? What is the teaching purpose that people are trying to accomplish here? Linguistic fussiness, this idea that everyone has to know proper names for all of the bits, the genitals, the things. Who decided that anatomical references were the proper ones that we have to use in society and teach our children? Isn't there a cultural connection to the real richness of sexual slang that in fact makes sex funny, crude, sort of challenging, sort of engaging? Isn't there a value to that as well? Isn't there something useful in a young person being able to learn that they have a weenie or a wee-wee or a pee-pee or a Kit Kat or any of those kind of rich terms that are universal? Why are we excluding those as part of a young person's education? And we don't even know how much precision young people need in terms of reproductive health knowledge. These are the national sexuality education standards in the US. They look something like this. And if you look through these in terms of core concepts, you'll notice here's the proper body part stuff. There's nothing about puberty or adolescent medicine, so we're leaving them in the dark about that piece. We're talking about reproduction, but not in very much detail. We're talking about healthy relationships in ways that may or may not fit young people's developmental needs because we don't know what they need to know about relationships at the age of 4, particularly as they pertain to the kinds of interpersonal relationships that we think sex is based in. This just illustrates, this is from a South American children's book writer named Isolde, and it lets you get a sense of how this is being explained. The meninos, the children, can activate a flow of water. So this is really sex, right? Activating a flow of water to purify themselves. It's cute. Each menino has a fountain. Some have the little hole model that comes hidden in an elegant fold. Some have the little tube model that is like a straw with a cushiony base. Now that's really, really strong medicine. You'll notice also that these figures are subtly gendered as well as sexed, and that's also an issue that comes up in the teaching of body parts. Rejection, the dismissing or refusing of an idea or proposal. At some point, we have to pay attention to the fact for decades, for hundreds of years, people, families, parents have made decisions to withhold certain kinds of discussions from their children on the basis of thinking they're not ready for it, that it usurps the traditional roles of families to give that to someone else, that it sexualizes children inappropriately. It's an inappropriate role for institutions. More than 100 years ago, Professor T.W. Shannon wrote in his book, A Guide to Sex Education, so this man was a progressive in his time. One day when our little girls were 4 and 6, wife said to me, I like the wife part, our little girls are asking where they were before they were born and how they got in the world. How are we to answer them? Tell them the truth, was my reply. But husband, they are not old enough to hear the full story of life. That would do them harm. That's a recurrent story here. A proposed sex education curriculum would start for children in Montana as early as kindergarten, caused quite a stir. In a big public meeting, the Montana Family Foundation president went on news to say he doesn't believe young children can emotionally deal with what they're being taught. And this web page from just last week when I put these slides together, children are continually bombarded with sexual propaganda. More and more children are experimenting with sexual encounters, contracting STDs, becoming pregnant, having abortions, and using contraception. I won't talk about the contradictions in that sentence, if you don't mind. Because of sex education programs, schools are taking away the parents' responsibility for teaching their child about human sexuality. Confusion, the lack of understanding and uncertainty. This is from the idea that by looking at the documented, demonstrated effectiveness of sex education in early adolescence and middle adolescence and even in late adolescence, and its effectiveness for preventing adverse outcomes and maybe encouraging positive outcomes. The extrapolation to that comes from this quote from a newspaper article, but there's also a growing body, not true, of research that specifically credits comprehensive sexuality education. A study from Georgetown University shows that starting sex ed in primary school helps avoid unintended pregnancies, maternal deaths, unsafe abortions, and STDs. All true until you go and look at the paper where they're talking about sexuality education for early adolescents, starting at about age 10, and not 4-year-olds. So, in summary, protect the innocence of children. Sexual ignorance is best. That's what our culture has taught us for 1,000 years. Just say no to sex education at age 4. Thank you.
So let's have another round for both of our presenters. We've had strong positions staked out here, and now it's your turn. We're going to take about 5 minutes that can be questions or statements. So we'll say questions or statements for about 5 minutes, and then we will re-vote. So the mics are open for people who have questions or statements. Please go ahead.
Hi, I have for the first presenter. Sorry, I forgot your name. There is any study or something that show any relation with sex education and prevention of sexual abuse in children or pedophilia or something like that? Because this is something that I think when you have sex education with children, they know how they can be safe, or they tell more about this if this happens.
Can you hear me? Oh, there it is. I hope that I hope I understood your question correctly. So what I would say is that in terms of preventing abuse, I think that there are a lot of efforts to teach children about good and bad touch, but a child is rarely in a position to block an abuser. A child is in a position to learn that, to be taught that if anyone ever tells you to lie to your parents, tell them immediately and they will protect you. Children cannot extract themselves from a situation when it's happening, but they can be taught to tell their parents or a trusted other adult when something is happening. But we can't teach them at that young age to stop anything.
Hi, my name's Will Geisler. I'm from Birmingham, Alabama, USA. It's known as the Bible Belt, and I am a father of 3 daughters. I strongly do believe in the concept of sexual education, even for younger age by parents. My concern is, and you even said it in your own discussion, was that ideally it would have to be basically non-judgmental and good education. And I have to say, I think in our school system where we are, I don't feel it can be non-judgmental. And I do worry about the predatory behavior of teachers, that we teach our kids to trust their teachers, and I do worry that there may be some teachers that are predatory and could take advantage of if you open that door to sexual education.
Well, it's a realistic fear, although it's a fear that all of us have about every time our children go off into the world. One of the issues, though, that I think is legitimate there is that the quality of preparation that teachers have for teaching these kinds of curriculum is really poor. There are few standards. There's hardly any quality assurance. There's very little sense that teachers are rewarded for that. So it's not clear to me that it attracts the brightest and the best.
Hi, I'm Reinaldo from Rio. I think as Mark told about Brazil education, sexual education in Brazil, we don't have sexual education really working in Brazil, and I hear this for oh my God, and then another aspect for all of you is about I guess the right time to talk about sexuality with children is when she asks about this. I have 2 cousins, and when she start to answer about something, sexuality, about penis, vagina, I think it's the right time to say something to them. I would like to hear you about this.
So I agree that when children ask questions about topics related to sex or gender or anything in the overall realm of sex ed, it's good to be prepared to answer them in an age-appropriate way. I think the best way to do it is to ask them what they already know, ask them why they're asking. We often find out that they're really asking a much simpler question than we ask. If you were suggesting that we don't teach children until they've asked, I would say 2 things. First of all, we often consciously or unconsciously discourage them from asking so that they learn not to ask adults, but ask other kids. And as I mentioned, they go to the internet earlier and earlier. And we don't really do that with anything else. Just wait until kids ask. We don't wait till they ask how to do long division before we teach it, or how to learn another language. We teach them. We figure out what is age appropriate, and there are guidelines that Dr. FOrtenberry doesn't agree with, I think, but there are guidelines from multiple organizations and various programs that have been developed about what is age appropriate. And the idea is not to go into exquisite detail about how to create pleasure for your partner with a 4-year-old. It's about what's age appropriate and beginning what becomes a multi-year educational process rather than just holding off on everything and throwing it all at them right when they're hitting puberty or later on.
Those will be our last comments, and I'll ask you can keep your comments or questions relatively brief, and then we're going to revote. Okay. So over here.
Derek Friedman, I'm from Ireland, equally conservative as the Bible Belt. About 20 or 30 years ago, I was asked to talk in primary schools. What impressed me was how much the kids of 8 and 9 and 10 knew already. And what I think maybe we should come away from is the term education, which is rather patronizing. And really, we should be giving them information, and information relevant to their age, and particularly information that protects them.
Okay. Dear Professor, my name is Xiaobing Wu. I'm from China. I have a baby girl, just 4 years old. So the topic is very interesting to me. My question is that why we talk about 4 years old, not 5 years old or 6 years old? If 4 years old is not the right time, when should start the sex education for the children?
Point exactly about our failure to understand actually the developmental trajectories of sexuality, which means that age 4 is arbitrarily chosen, and the content of the curricula that's proposed is also arbitrarily matched to that age, but does not necessarily is not necessarily based on a developmental understanding of sexuality within children of that age. So from my perspective, it's an arbitrary assignment and is subject to the vicissitudes of arbitrary assignments like that. So it may be right, it may be wrong, and we don't know, and we don't have a way to know.
So I'm going to turn things back over to Dr. Patel, who will help us reach a decision on this motion.
Right. So we've heard 2 impassioned presentations, and it's now time for you to focus your minds again and for us to take a vote. So for those of you who would agree with Dennis that it is too early, age 4 is too early to start sex education, could I now have a show of hands, please? And those who would agree with Mark that age 4 is fine. Okay. A lot. Now, so thank you very much. Now, what I would say to you is this, that the way debates are done and how the results are calculated, there are various rules. The Oxford Union's rules of working this is to look for swings, not necessarily absolute numbers. So, of course, the absolute numbers, both before and after our debate, both show that Mark would have won. But actually, the number of votes that Dennis got increased. So I think they're both winners, but Dennis managed to persuade more people. Okay, so thank you very much to our speakers and to our participants for your contributions. I'll call it to a close. The poster session is starting down for those who go down there. Thank you.
Well done, thank you.